Let's take a quick minute or two to learn about drop-down menus. Drop-down menus are really easy, but they do require two elements. And when we get into the world of JavaScript, it does make it a little bit more complicated, but it does keep our HTML nice and simple. So when we write a drop-down menu, we use the select element, and inside of that, we use another element, a child element called option, and we can give it unlimited number of options, and it will create a drop-down for us. Now, there are some particular attributes that we can use when we submit a form to get particular values. We're going to look at all of this in this video. Alrighty, so I just have VS Code open here, and I'm going to resave buttons as dropdowns.html. Let's call this dropdowns, and let's go ahead and get rid of this input field. And when we go ahead and check out this page, we are going to see a button. Boring button, because it's not going to do anything for us. Now we need to create a drop-down menu. We've looked at text area, we've looked at input fields, we've looked at buttons. Let's go ahead and take a look at a drop-down menu. Now a drop-down menu is called a select field. So we give it a select, and that filled out far too much for me. I want to take this one at a different pace because we've been going at lightning speed, so I think we should slow it down a bit. Now, much like the text area, it has an opening and closing tag, whereas the input field does not. We can give it an ID because that's a global class or a global attribute. We can give it a class, that's a global attribute if we wanted. We definitely need to give it a name, so let's call it selected option. Selected item. And when we save and refresh our page, we see, well, there's a dropdown, but there are no options yet. So now this looks a lot like a list. So when we have an unordered list, we have an li in here. Let's just do that, li, item 1, item 2, item 3, and so on and so on and so on. The pattern here is that we have a parent element, and then we have options. And when we're dealing with select, we have the exact same thing in here. We have select as the parent element, and when we have options, I mean that literally. It's actually called option. So we give it option number 1, option number 2, and let's give it one more. Let's go option number 3. You know when you say one word so many times that it starts to lose meaning? That's what option just did for me. So let's go ahead and refresh our page, and now we can see option 1, 2, and 3. So now we have different options in here. The problem is when we submit our page, let's take a look at our form method. We're using get. So this select should have a name of selected underscore item is equal to something in the URL. Selected item in here is equal to option plus a bunch of other stuff. That's not what we want. What we're telling it is basically this is the value. That's not a way to live your life because this value could be anything. This is just text. We don't want text to be the final option. So what we do is we give it a value. So we say value, and let's say option 1. And maybe this one is going to be something else. And you notice how I'm not using spaces? That's important. Try not to use spaces if you don't have to. Spaces just complicate things in the world of web development. And let's say last option for this value. Okay, so now when I refresh the page, I have options 1, 2, and 3, but the difference is when I submit it now, it actually says in my URL bar, selected item is equal to option 1. Or if I select number 2, it says something else. Or number 3, it's going to say item selected is equal to last option. There it is. Now let's say you have a list in here, and maybe you aren't in total control of the list. You have all these different options and you want one of these to be selected already. So let's do this. Selected is equal to selected. This is XHTML, but if you just want to write regular HTML, just selected should do the trick. And it just looks like that. So let's save and let's refresh the page. Get rid of that stuff. And option number 3, it's already selected. Now let's go ahead and move this to option number 2. And when I refresh, option number 2 is selected. Occasionally, the refresh actually is going to cache whatever you had selected before. So sometimes you have to come up to your URL bar and just hit enter again, and it should refresh for you. Now don't add selected is equal to selected on multiple items, because what happens if we put it on number 2 and number 3? Well, they can't both be selected, and that's going to throw some sort of problem out there. So it's going to go with the last one. It says option number 3 is selected, but we actually just wanted option number 2 to be selected. So when you copy and paste, just be really careful. And lastly, let's take a look at an option in here. The value is going to be nothing. Let's make this required. And in here, we're going to say dash dash select item dash dash. And actually, we want to get rid of this selected. Refresh our page and we have selected item. What happens if you select this? Well, it's going to submit still. Actually, no, because we have required on here. It says there's no value. It's not going to submit. So that's one way of adding some sort of validation here. But if we remove that, it says question mark selected underscore item is equal to nothing. What we do here is we can add disabled is equal to disabled, or in regular HTML, just disabled should do the trick. Give that a refresh. And we can't even select it anymore. Now to make that selected, we do selected is equal to selected. Refresh our page. And now it is selected, but we can't reselect it. So we can't get back to there. And that's a pretty common thing. You see that in a lot of drop-down menus on a lot of websites. Now you can still select it because the document object model, the browser, has selected it for you. So that's not really good. Instead, what we do is we add required, which I got a little ahead of myself before. Add required to the select element and refresh our page. It's currently select item. That's the one that's selected. And when I submit, it doesn't work. And that's what we want. We want to tell people, hey, select an item. Make sure you actually select one. Let's select number 2. And in our URL bar, we have selected item is equal to something else. Now, again, when it comes to forms, we are not actually doing anything. We're just sending data through the URL or through a post method, which is sort of like an invisible way of sending data. We aren't actually doing anything with that data. HTML does not have that capability, but we are setting ourselves up for success in the future for when we want to use select and options, and when we want to use text areas and input fields and all sorts of different form fields. And this way we can eventually, when we start working with another programming language, we can use that same data and we can store it in a database. And then we can create user logins, user permissions. We could create a social network. You could create a dating site. You could create anything you really want. Literally every piece of data that gets submitted on a web page goes through a form of some variety. Okay, so your task for this video is going to be create a form, method is equal to get, create a select. It does not have to have ID and class in there. Give it a name. It does not have to have required either. And give it 3 options. And just tinker around with the different variations. So maybe add disabled to one, add selected to another, add required to your select field, and then submit your form with a button like what we have here. Submit your form and just see what is happening with the values. Make sure that it's showing up in your URL bar the way you expect it to. And if it doesn't, tinker around some more until you get it. Because again, this is a really important lesson. Once you have all of that figured out, let's head on over to that next lesson where, guess what? We're not talking about forms anymore, thankfully. So we're going to learn something a little less overwhelming. I'm going to put it that way. It's a little less overwhelming. And so when you're done, I'll meet you over there and we'll learn about something different other than forms.